Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the second edition of our Tuesday night Bible studies online here at Trinity Baptist Church in Sherwood Park. Whether you're part of Trinity or you're just someone else who's found us on the internet, welcome. We normally do about a 20 to 25 minute Bible study in this particular session. Just so you all know, this particular session was pre-recorded, but I am live with you on Facebook tonight. So if you are commenting at all in the comments section from 7 till whenever this video ends, I'll be able to interact with you there, and you can interact with each other too, and I'd really encourage you to do that. This is only one of a number of small groups that are happening at Trinity. Of course, during this COVID time, some of them are happening online, such as this one, but there are other ones that are meeting in person as well. And if you're interested in some of those particular offerings, just get in contact with me and I can try and set you up with some of the other options that are out there. This particular study, if this is your first time joining us, is one where we stick pretty closely to the text. What I'm hopefully trying to do is model for you what careful, close reading of the Bible looks like with some at least half-decent Bible study methods. So I would encourage you to get a Bible and to follow along. As you know, if you've been with us last week, we are walking through the Old Testament book of Daniel. That's what we'll be doing basically from now until probably early December or so. I think one of the things about this particular study is it just tracks the faithfulness that some individuals had before God in the midst of some pretty crazy circumstances that were quite out of their control. Not exactly the same circumstances as how we find ourselves in COVID, but there's at least some similarities there for us, and I think we can learn from that. Now, if you were here last week, you know kind of what we went all through, but let me recap it for those of you that may have missed it. What we did last week, a whole lot of, is we actually started by looking at the book as a whole and just gave a little bit of an introduction to it. I gave us some of the literary context of it and some of the historical context. I won't repeat all that here, but you can go back to last week's section and you can follow along. But one other plug that I wanted to put in is if you go to the BibleProject.com, I just really like this resource. You can search up different books of the Bible there, and they have videos you can watch and even some things that you can download that will show an overall kind of big picture structural view of a book. This particular one, I don't expect you to be able to read this, but you can see the title. It's for Daniel, and what they've done very artistically is just given an outline to the whole book. I think it's really good stuff. So check it out. The Bible Project is what it's called, and that resource is there for all of us. But what we did look at as well last week is we looked at the context and the opening stuff, but we looked at chapter 1 as well. And chapter 1, in many ways, sets the stage for the rest of the book. We learn there that Daniel and his friends, along with many others, were taken into exile from Israel into the ancient country and kingdom of Babylon. And there they were submitted into a pretty hefty kind of reprogramming program to get them ready to serve as officials within the kingdom. But it was a really weird time for them where they were trying to figure out what parts of their identity to retain and what parts were flexible in their new situation. But they ran into a thing, and that was to do with what they could eat. And Daniel, for whatever reason, really dug in his heels about eating food that he thought was defiled, courageously asked for an exception. And of course, one thing led to another, and he bartered out a basically like a contest to see who would be healthier, eating either the king's rations, which was defiled, or just plain old vegetables. And miraculously, Daniel and his buddies appeared more healthy, and basically, we end chapter 1 with a summary statement about Daniel's whole career. It says, and Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. So that kind of tells us the whole length of his career, but then it backs up in chapter 2, and we see in chapter 2 that we're going to get into another kind of contest as such, like a court context. The main characters that we're going to see in chapter 2 of Daniel are, of course, Daniel and King Nebuchadnezzar. So here's a little bit about each of them. Daniel, I think you can characterize him as kind of a steady Freddy guy, rock solid. I wouldn't necessarily say stoic, but definitely calm. and he's portrayed very much as a wise man. And we mean that in the full biblical sense of a person with biblical wisdom. You also notice Daniel never really changes much in the story. He doesn't kind of transform himself from a bad guy to a good guy or grow in a whole bunch of ways. He's kind of steady. Nebuchadnezzar, on the other hand, what a contrast. This guy is probably the most volatile character in the book. Sometimes he's good, sometimes he's bad. He's just really unstable. In chapter 2, verse 1, it sets this whole thing with in the second year of his reign. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. He's likely got some things going on both externally and internally that are causing all this. Externally, he was always worried about kind of major politics in the world and armies that were around. He'd already defeated Egypt and some others, but he had other armies that were around from other nations that he needed to be careful about. It seems too that he was suspicious of some of the people who worked closely with him, some of the wise men, and we'll see that right in our story today. Wondering who's a traitor of his, who's a friend, who's a foe, who's a fraud. Doesn't seem to trust them. So very suspicious, very insecure. Probably that's what's going on in the background that's making him restless. But he had this dream that's talked about, and that really sets up the whole rest of the chapter. You're going to see 4 sections to this chapter, and I'll hold this page up multiple times. But we're going to kind of see it kind of goes kind of 1, 2, and then 3 here, and then back up to number 4 up top. So the first bit that we're going to see is that Nebuchadnezzar, he has this dream, and then he does this weird decree. So let's just kind of walk through that quickly. We've already talked about verse 1. He's troubled by things. You and I can relate to that. We've been, each of us, for our own reasons, have been kept awake at night worrying about different things. But in verse 2, he then summons his wise men. He summons the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. And we'll see how it goes. In verses 4 through 6, he does a really bold decree. He says, "Tell me my dream, and then tell me its meaning, or else." Now, he gives a reward, or promised reward, if people can do it successfully, but if not, they're going to lose their lives. And it's in this section, in verse 4, when the astrologers say, "May the king live forever, tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it." It's at that point of the book where the book switches from the Hebrew language to the Aramaic language. I mentioned this last week, and I said I might kind of give a reason why. Well, here's the thing. As a bit of review, Aramaic would have been the kind of court language of both the Babylonians and the Persians later on. It was kind of like an international language, as it were, of the time. And so I think it's interesting that Daniel makes this switch, but I think it's because Daniel's wanting to demonstrate that Yahweh, that the biblical God, is the Lord over all the nations. He's not just the God of the Hebrews. He's the God of everyone. And so there's a switch to the everybody language, this international language of Aramaic, for a number of chapters. Okay, anyway, so he tells them, "Tell me my dream, interpret it for me." And these guys, they don't really like that. They're like, "Well, tell us the dream, and then we'll interpret it." And the king, you can see in verses 8 and 9, you can see here's where he is really getting suspicious. Verse 9, "If you do not tell me the dream, there is only one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change." You can see that suspicion there that he has of them. So he lays down the gauntlet. You got to tell me the dream, and you've got to interpret it for me. Well, the astrologers, I mean, they freak out. In verse 10 and 11, you can see their reaction here. To them, this is an unprecedented request, totally unreasonable request. No king has ever made this kind of request before. And they say it boldly, and then right at the end of verse 11, listen to this cryptic little statement. "What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods. And they do not live among humans. We'll come back to that very shortly. But Nebuchadnezzar, as a result of all this pushback from the wise men, he flips out. Verse 12. This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men in Babylon. And all of them meant all of them. And that would have included, of course, the ones who were there natively as Babylonians, but it would have included Daniel and his three friends as well. So everybody would have been under the gun, so to speak. Well, that takes us to the end of the first segment. It's all about Nebuchadnezzar. We'll go to the second segment here where God reveals the dream to Daniel, and Daniel responds with praise to God. So we'll get to that real quick. This goes from verses 14 down to verse 23. Daniel, of course, the first few verses, verses 14 and 15 and 16, he courageously again goes to another official. We saw him do that back in chapter 1, but he courageously goes to an official and he basically tries to buy some time. And surprise, surprise, some time is given to him. So what does he do with that time? Well, verses 17 and 18, I'll read it to you. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends. I should have practiced these names. I can never pronounce this stuff under the camera. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So it's this huge call to prayer. And they pray, obviously. And of course, amazingly, again, another miracle, God answers that prayer. The God of heaven, the one not like a human, but the only kind of person who could ever fulfill this, does. Verse 19, during the night the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven. And we aren't told what the dream is yet. We just know that Daniel's got the answer. Daniel, of course, then responds, and in your Bible, you might have this kind of offset as poetry or like a psalm of praise. Daniel gives praise to God for the way that God has answered his prayer. This isn't the last time we'll see some written praise in the book of Daniel either, but Daniel starts it off. And this particular bit from verses 20 down to 23, I mean, this could fit very easily in the book of Psalms. But very quickly, he starts by praising God's name and his attributes in verse 20. Then in verses 21 and 22, he recites God's deeds, how God changes things like times and seasons, and kings, and how God gives wisdom. And then lastly, in verse 23, Daniel gives a very personal thanks to God for the very personal thing that God had done to give him this dream and its interpretation. It was going to save a lot of lives. So then we get into the third section down here where Daniel reveals the dream and reveals its meaning to King Nebuchadnezzar. So this goes from verses 24 to 45, kind of a longer section. The first three verses of that, verses 24 to 26, you can see that Daniel requests a rather quick hearing with the king that could save a lot of lives, and he's granted permission to do that. I can't help but think here that there's just strong parallels between this particular story and what's going on here with what happens in a different book of the Bible, the very first book of the Bible, actually, in Genesis chapter 41. Some of you remember the story of Joseph, who ended up being sold into slavery in this faraway land. And in that time, he ended up in prison for something he didn't do. Anyway, long story short, he was given the ability to interpret dreams, much like Daniel here. And Joseph there in Genesis 41 was able to interpret a dream to one of the pharaohs of Egypt. And because he was able to give that dream and that interpretation, many, many lives were saved and spared from famine. And here in this story, we're going to see, of course, Daniel saving the lives of all of his fellow wise men, not just his Hebrew buddies, but everybody. So he starts off in verses 27 to 30. He's standing there before Nebuchadnezzar now, and he gives a little intro about the dream. He says that no person would normally be able to do this. Only God can reveal such things. And let's actually read that, verse 27. Daniel replied, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. I just love Daniel's humility in the midst of that. That's something that is just a godly virtue that we see him showing over and over and over again. Well, after a little bit of that introduction, he gets to the dream itself. And so he just mentions it quite matter-of-factly in verses 31 to 35. There's this statue that he sees. And he describes what the statue is kind of made of. I mean, it kind of looks like a human. And starting with the head, a head of gold, you'll notice that as you go kind of down from head to toe, that it goes in descending value of precious metal, from gold to silver to bronze, and lastly to iron. Now, of course, iron is typically the strongest, but those feet mixed with clay kind of shows there's something quite brittle going on here. And the other thing that features really prominently in this dream is this rock, a rock that appears, that is this cutout, not by human hands, but it comes and destroys it, and then it gets really, really, really big, a mountain that fills the whole earth. Now that might just sound kind of like gobbledygook, kind of weird, but you have to read this in the context of other Old Testament prophets. So here's some familiar words from Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2. Isaiah, one of the best known and beloved prophets in Israel's history. So Isaiah writes this: "In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it." No doubt, this is what Daniel is tapping into here in this dream, that the mountain of the Lord will just, I mean, it's like a rock that will fill the whole earth. So he tells the dream. Then he's going to switch gears and he's going to give the meaning of the dream. And this goes from verse 36 down to verse 45. He mentions that Nebuchadnezzar is this head of gold. And I think that Nebuchadnezzar probably likes hearing this, not just because it's gold and it's fancy, but there's no dramatic ending to this particular kingdom. I think Nebuchadnezzar, as we know, he seems to be very suspicious, very anxious, insecure. And the way that Daniel's telling this dream interpretation, sounds like nothing bad is going to happen to Nebuchadnezzar imminently, like someone crossing him and assassinating him or anything like that. And then it goes on from there to talk about the next three kingdoms, for a total of 4 kingdoms. Now, just a few details here about this. There is another dream that involves 4 kingdoms that's going to appear in Daniel in chapter 7. And so you can look at this one that's happening in chapter 2 and the one that's happening in chapter 7 as kind of like bookmarks or frames. And then we're going to keep narrowing down as we go through some of the other chapters. But I also want you to know that this kind of way of talking about kingdoms and then with a final really, really good one, it's actually not totally uncommon in ancient Near Eastern literature. They would often talk about this kingdom and that kingdom and that kingdom, and then a really big one. So Daniel seems to be borrowing, can I say borrowing? Some different kind of common language at the time to say a really important point about the really true ultimate kingdom being God's kingdom. So which ones are these? Well, I think especially when you get into chapter 7, you'll see, seems that Daniel's quite plainly talking about Babylon, and then Media, and then the kingdom of Persia. And then there's some debate. Is the 4th one Greece or is it Rome? Some people say this, some people say that. But no matter what, everyone agrees that God's kingdom is the last one. And it's the best one, it's the full one, it's the final one. Let's read how Daniel concludes his message there to Nebuchadnezzar. "The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy." Boom. So he shuts his mouth, and then you got to think, did he get it right? We don't know. And that's where we get into the last bit. Nebuchadnezzar praises Daniel and God, and then makes some decrees. So let's look at that. Nebuchadnezzar praises Daniel first in verse 46. He even bows down to him. Yikes, that's a little bit overkill. I don't think Daniel would have been into that. In verse 47, though, he compliments the God of Daniel as being, wow, quite the God. And then in verse 48 and 49, Nebuchadnezzar, he's true to his word here. He said he would reward the person who could do this. And he, of course, promotes Daniel. And then at Daniel's request, he also promotes Daniel's 3 friends, which is a wonderful way to end the story. Kind of a feel-good story by the end of it. This is one story of many, and there's going to be some repeated themes in them. But hey, we're at the 20-minute mark. I thought maybe I'll give you 3 thoughts of application for us as we conclude our time here for chapter 2. First thing I want to say is that we, as God's people, as Christians, we are blessed to be a blessing. We stand in this long line that even goes all the way back to Abraham in early parts of Genesis, where God tells us that we are to be a blessing. And he's going to be a conduit where he'll bless us, and that blessing is supposed to go out to all nations. We see that kind of thing happening here so plainly in this book. Daniel's actions and God's giving him of this dream and everything, it saved a whole bunch of people, not just the Hebrews, and not just his buddies, but a whole bunch of people. It wasn't just about his tribe. And we need to have that same kind of mindset always, that God has given us this commission to be a blessing to other people. There's a lot of ways you can apply this, of course. I know one of the things that we always talk about these days is COVID. And I just think we as Christians, we need to be loving our neighbors well this way. I'm a little bit frustrated at some Christians who seem to dig in their heels and they disregard government regulations and they insist on their freedom to worship in ways that they think is fine without masks and without distancing and blah, 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 blah. They make the news sometimes about this stuff. But their neighbors are looking at them thinking, do you care about us or do you only care about your own rights? That's not cool. We're blessed to be a blessing to other people. So even when it comes to things like COVID, it's a matter of caring not just for ourselves and what's good for us, but caring for our neighbors as well. That's just one of those little ways of applying this big, long, grand vocational call that we have as God's people, that we're blessed to be a blessing. Second thing, and we see this happening so clearly here, God gives wisdom and knowledge and strength. God gives wisdom and knowledge and strength that comes from outside of ourselves into us. And he loves to do this to those who ask in prayer. Isn't that interesting that Daniel's response when he buys some time is to go with his buddies and they spend some significant time in prayer. And in response to that prayer is when God gives the wisdom and the knowledge and the strength. That reminds me in the New Testament, James chapter 1, verse 5 tells us, if any of us lack wisdom, ask God for it. It's that simple. Well, it sounds simple, but it does involve fervent prayer. And there's strength that comes from the wisdom that God gives, and we see Daniel exhibiting that. Thirdly and lastly, history is not meaningless. I think this one you can take a global perspective. You can even think about your own life and the things that you go through. Sometimes we just get frustrated. We like look at the sky and think, why is God allowing this or that? Like it's just like, well, to be honest, I mean, some really gut-wrenching things that we see are hard to explain. I'm not trying to be trite here. But God has purposes that he works through various events and kings and kingdoms. And we're going to see this multiple times in the book of Daniel. God has his own purposes. And that should give us hope that we will eventually arrive at his full and final kingdom. And that's a day that we can really look forward to. And this book is one of a number in Scripture that can give us great hope towards that end. Excellent. So we've come to the end of Daniel chapter 2. We're going to carry on with chapter 3 next week. Thanks for taking the time to listen in here. Again, feel free to shoot questions on the comments section, and I'll try and interact with them. Feel free to say hello to other people who might be commenting as well. I know this isn't like a small group where we see each other face to face, but we can enjoy a little bit of time here together. Thanks again so much for taking the time to be with me and with others tonight. We'll see you around soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.